Welcome to the African Weekly Roundup, a weekly program every Sunday here on HORUFADHI Media where I discuss the latest news and events across the African continent. I'm Sultan Muhammad, your host and producer here on HORUFADHI Media. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media. Also, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media Group's second channel, known as HORUFADHI TV, where you can find exclusive programs such as Behind the Scenes and Salah, among others. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Muhammad, Suleiman Hashi, Yasin Abdi, and the wider HORUFADHI Media team on our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment. Let's get straight into the news. And we kick off over to Senegal, where the Senegalese President Macky Sall on Saturday appointed a new Prime Minister, a position he abolished in 2019 and reinstated in 2021 after July's tense legislative elections. A presidential decree named Amadou Ba, a former foreign minister, as the new premier of the country, 5 days after the return of parliament, which was marked by a series of incidences and carried out under heavy security. Now, Ba has served under Sall as finance minister between 2013 and 2019, before becoming foreign minister in 2019 up until 2020. Now, Sall promised to appoint a figure from the winning party in the polls. His coalition narrowly won the election but was only able to keep its absolute majority with the support of an opposition parliamentarian. In a speech to the nation broadcasted on Friday, Sall said the new prime minister would be responsible for addressing the rising cost of living. Ba, the new prime minister, also echoed these sentiments during his first speech after presidency's secretary general read out the decree. Now, Sall was elected in 2012 for 7 years and re-elected in 2019 for another 5. When Sall removed the premier role, the opposition and parts of civil society denounced his attempt to seize greater power. Concerns over his rule persist, and some accuse him of wanting to break the 2-term limit and run again in the expected elections in 2024. Now, Sall has fallen out with key figures in his own camp. Former Prime Minister Aminata Mimi Touré, who was not chosen to lead the National Assembly, has since denounced, and I quote, injustice. Now, tensions have been high in the politically stable West African country of 17.5 million people since violent protests broke out last year after Sonko, who came third in the latest 2019 presidential election, was arrested on rape charges. Now, Sonko, the opposition leader, has denied these allegations. Opposition groups across Senegal, who are opposed to President Sall's rule, have accused the government of holding fraudulent elections during parliamentary elections earlier this year, but this has been denounced by the government and the Electoral Commission. Now, over to Sudan, where flooding has killed at least 134 people and destroyed tens of thousands of homes in the northeastern African country during its ongoing wet season, according to the government on Thursday. Now, heavy rains usually fall between May and October in Sudan, which faces severe flooding each year, wrecking property, infrastructure, and crops. Now, the National Council for Civil Defense said the floods have killed a total of 134 people, left 120 others injured, and damaged or destroyed more than 128,000 homes so far this wet season. Now, water can be seen engulfing villages and roads in the footage of the flooding aired on state television. People have taken shelter under makeshift tents made from shattered fabrics after the floodwaters washed away mud brick homes. Last month, the government declared a state of emergency due to flooding in 6 of Sudan's 18 states. This season's death toll has risen from 112 given earlier this month. And in the latest figures, the highest number of fatalities occurred in the central state of North Kordofan, while the largest figure of home collapses was recorded in the southern White Nile state. The main causes of deaths were collapsing homes, drowning, and electrocution. Now, the eastern states of Gadaref and Kassala, and north and south Kordofan state, River Nile state, and the region of Darfur were among the worst affected, according to the UN's Children's Agency, UNICEF. Now, the UN has warned that the flooding this year could affect up to 460,000 people, far higher than the average 388,000 people affected annually between 2017 and 2021. Now, the disaster comes as Sudan reels from deepening political unrest and spiraling economic crisis exacerbated by last year's military coup led by Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Now, over to Kenya, where William Ruto was sworn in as Kenya's president earlier this week. He narrowly won August 9th election over long-term opposition figure Raila Odinga. Now, the Supreme Court last week rejected challenges to the official results. Now, the results were initially rejected by opposition leader Odinga, which resulted in the case heading to Kenya's Supreme Court. However, the court ruled in favor of the Electoral Commission, despite a number of commissioners rejecting the result. Now, Chief Justice Martha Koome, who headed the 7-member Supreme Court, left no ambiguity about the court's position on key arguments brought by Odinga's team and other complainants. She dismissed some allegations that the polling station result forms had been tampered with as double hearsay and one as no more than hot air, a wild goose chase. Some of the computer logs presented as evidence, she said, were either from logs arising from 2017 elections or were outright forgeries, she explained. Now, Kume raised the possibility of perjury, noting that 2 people who filed the initial complaints allegedly on behalf of polling station agents had not even spoken to those agents. She also called for reforms at the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission, saying that the boardroom rupture between the commissioners had undermined public confidence. Now, the newly elected president Ruto had been a deputy to outgoing President Uhuru Kenyatta, but had a bitter split with the latter that left the two not speaking for a month at a time, with Ruto eventually appointing Kenyatta as the special peace envoy for the conflict in northern Ethiopia and Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, a decision welcomed warmly by the United States and opposition figures. Now, on Tuesday, the audience cheered as the two shook hands. Scores of people were crushed and injured as Kenyans on Tuesday forced their way into a stadium where the president was being inaugurated. Now, Ruto is taking power in a country heavily burdened by debt that will challenge his efforts to fulfill sweeping campaign promises made to Kenya's poor. Now, Ruto has been a deputy to outgoing President Uhuru Kenyatta. Kenyatta on Monday publicly congratulated Ruto for the first time on his win, which does indicate some sort of unity in the country. Now, with the transition, Kenya's presidency moves from one leader indicted by the International Criminal Court to another. Both Kenyatta and Ruto were accused over their roles in the deadly 2007 post-election violence, but the cases were later closed amid allegations of witness intimidation. Now, the August election was peaceful in the country, and the most peaceful with a country that has a history of political violence. Chaos erupted only in final minutes when the Electoral Commission publicly split and prominent Odinga supporters tried to physically stop the declaration of Ruto as president. Now, over to Northern Africa, where Tunisian president has issued an electoral law on Thursday, reducing but not ending the role of political parties in a reformed parliament that will have fewer powers under the constitution passed in July. Under the new law, voters will choose candidates on December 17th election individually rather than by selecting a single party list, a switch that could weaken the influence of parties. Now, the unilateral changes are the latest that President Kais Saied has made to Tunisia's political system since he seized most powers last summer in a move his foes called anti-democratic coup to establish a one-man rule. We are passing through a new stage in the history of Tunisia towards the sovereignty of the people after previous sham elections, said Saied during a cabinet meeting. And the main parties across Tunisia's political spectrum have already rejected the law, saying that they will boycott any elections under Saied's new constitution, which has greatly expanded his powers and removed most checks on his actions. And the constitution was passed overwhelmingly in a referendum in which official figures showed only 30% of voters took part, though opposition parties have accused the authorities of inflating even that low rate of participation. Now, the previous democratic constitution from 2014 enshrined a major role for parliament, giving it the main responsibility for forming government, while the president had less direct power. So his new constitution has instead brought the government directly under the president, while reducing the influence of the new two-chamber parliament. Now, the lower new chamber will only have 161 members compared to the previous 217, and details on the second chamber, including how its members will be elected, have not yet been issued by the government. Following recent criticism by the US government on the handling of the electoral process, President Saied rejected this criticism, calling it an unacceptable interference in the domestic Tunisian affairs, and has denied his actions constitute a coup or that he will become any sort of dictator. Now, over to Washington, D.C., where South African President Cyril Ramaphosa met President Joe Biden at the White House on Friday in a visit to the country that included a meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris and a reception at South African Embassy for the Congressional Black Caucus and veterans of the U.S. anti-apartheid movement. According to the statement from the South African presidency, the Oval Office talks focused on a range of issues including trade and investment, energy, food security, global security, health, reform to the United Nations, and a controversial bill introduced in the United States House of Representatives that the South African president said would unfairly marginalize and punish African countries for exercising their sovereignty. Now, Mr. Biden on Friday discussed relations with Russia in a White House meeting statement with the South African president, who has resisted joining Washington's campaign against Moscow for the war in Ukraine. Biden, who has led an international coalition to challenge President Putin for the near 7-month war in Ukraine, wants South Africa's help in efforts that include forcing Moscow to sell its oil at below market rates. After a jovial greeting before the press, the two leaders spoke privately in the Oval Office for more than an hour on topics that included trade, climate, energy, said the White House. Now, Biden has also announced $45 million in funding for an $8.5 billion multinational venture aimed at accelerating the phasing out of coal-fired power generation in South Africa. Now, the additional US funding for the Just Energy Transition Partnership comes at a time when declining natural gas and oil exports from Russia and Ukraine have boosted South African coal and set back decarbonization goals for one of the world's most carbon-intensive economies. In recent weeks, Biden and his aides have been ramping up engagements with African countries as they cast a wary eye on investments and diplomacy by rivals China and Russia on the continent. We've seen last month a series of travels by both US and Russian foreign ministers to a number of African countries, including Ethiopia, in an attempt to bolster support. Now, South African president has resisted calls to directly criticize Russia, instead opposing the use of force generally. In March, he blamed NATO's eastward expansion for instability and said the conflict should be solved through the United Nations mediation rather than Western-led sanctions that hurt bystander countries. Now, South Africa is one of the 17 African countries, to abstain from the UN vote condemning Russia's assault. And this is a common theme across the African continent. Now, that's all the top stories this week. Please tune in next week for another weekly update of events across our beloved African continent.